today you find me in the centre of Cardiff. As much as it doesn't look like that at all, this is in Butte Park, and I'm cowering in the woodland because, yet again, I've forgotten the ND filter for this camera. Starting to become a bit of a pattern. But I did at least remember the one for my phone, so the B-roll will be on this. Hopefully it turns out alright. I also forgot my wallet, which doesn't actually matter as much as forgetting your ND filter, as it turns out. But anyway, I'm here because I want to talk about haze. Not atmospheric haze, but instead haze on lenses. And this is something you're going to bump into when you're shopping for a vintage lens, such as this 55 2.8. Don't know where that dog came from. This Mamiya 55 f2.8 I bought off of eBay, and someone had previously tried to repair it and had somehow filled it entirely full of red grease. I think from a bicycle or something, but whatever they did, they completely ballsed it up, and this lens is completely unrepairable now for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into over the rest of this video. But anyway, what is haze? Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how it occurs in a lens and whether you can fix it, although evidently not with this one. And finally, what effect does it have on your photos, and does it mean that the lens is completely unusable? Let's go and find out, and have a nice wander through Cardiff in the sun, because I haven't seen it in a while. The reason why old manual focus lenses feel so nice to use is because of the helicoid. It's two rings of screw threads that mesh together, and as you turn the focus ring, you're pushing them further into that thread or further out from the thread. And there's little stopper things to stop it from disintegrating entirely. But that thread has to be greased. Now, the difference between grease and an oil, very quickly, is that grease stays where you put it and oil moves around. I think there's more to it than that, but that's the general gist. So you use grease on the helicoids, but the greases used when these lenses were made tend to degrade over time. They have a maximum shelf life. Now that's a problem, because you'll first notice it getting gritty as you'll start feeling the solid components of the grease sort of clumping together in the thread, but the more liquid components, which is effectively an oil at that point, will start drifting inside the lens. Now, this is what causes stuck aperture blades, because aperture blades should be entirely dry. Any sort of liquid on them will prevent them from opening it really quickly, etc. It's a huge problem. That's the main cause. But the worst problem they cause is the haze. The aperture blades are very fixable. The haze is tiny droplets of that oil being deposited on the interior lens surfaces. Now, if you were to catch this very quickly when it happened, which is unlikely because this is a gradual process, it happens over years, then you could just clean it off and nothing would be any the worse. You could then replace all the grease, which is what you do when you restore these lenses, and replace it with a synthetic grease that won't degrade in the future, and you'll be having a great time. But unfortunately, the oil that's deposited on those lenses will eat away at the coatings on the lens. And that's a huge problem, because that damage is permanent. In theory, you can polish that coating off of the lens, but the coating was there for a reason, so you're going to affect something about how the lens performs, and even worse, you might change the shape of the lens itself. So if it gets to that point, consider that haze permanent. You're probably not going to be able to fix it, and it will affect your photos. But how badly? Well, I've got a roll of Harman Phoenix 200 in here, which is a very interesting colour film. Let's go and take some photos around Cardiff, and then I'll swap to some black and white or something and go indoors. Yes, so this second photo is much more how I was expecting this test to go, and I'll address the points around that later. But the first photo was quite wild, and I think there are two main issues. Number one, I shot directly into the sun with a lot of extra light bouncing off everything, and I overexposed because I was trying to expose for the shadows, which is normally what you want to do in backlit scenarios to try and make them not entirely silhouetted. And the problem with that was this film, which is Harman Phoenix 200, doesn't have very wide latitude. It doesn't like very strong over or underexposure. And by trying to sort of aim for a midpoint, it's just done something wild. The colours are bizarre. The sort of orange side of it is kind of towards what I was expecting, but then the blueness of it, the weird lines, it's really, really weird. But it is the outlier here. So there are two main effects that I'm looking for from this hazy lens that I'm expecting to see. Number one being reduced contrast. Understandable. It's going to have a sort of a softer look to it, especially with stronger light sources, and they will have a stronger glow. Now, you do get a bit of a glow from light sources on film in particular, because of the way it works. It's a bit different to digital sensors. On a modern digital camera with a modern lens, I would not expect to see any glow at all from a light source. That's why people use diffusion filters. But on film, I'd expect a little bit. On these, it's very strong, and I love it. I think it looks great. It's very interesting, and on the indoor photos in particular, I think it gives a really nice soft look to it. In the outdoor ones, it's very strong. But it's a look, and it's something that you can exploit to your benefit. The other thing that I'm sort of expecting to see are ghosts, sort of artifacts from the damage on the lens appearing in certain situations. And this next photo does show something like that. This small blue ghost in the bottom of the photo. That is something I would expect to see in a situation like this, where you're shooting directly into the sun and with a fairly deep aperture as well. It is something that I would expect to be rendered a little bit more clearly then. I'm not entirely certain what aperture sizes it's going to be most prevalent, but in this instance, you can see it appearing in the bottom. You're going to get lens flare on most lenses when you're shooting into the sun. This is a little bit different. It's not consistent with the shape of the lens. I believe this to be an imprint of the damage on that internal element. But it doesn't appear in many of the photos at all. I think it's only this one that I've noticed, maybe another one. It's interesting how little effect it actually had on the images, considering it's what I would consider to be relatively obvious damage to the lens element, albeit not very opaque. So maybe that's the reason why it doesn't appear to have caused as much of a problem as I was expecting. So a conclusion then, about this lens in particular, I guess. Now, this lens is properly bollocksed. When it arrived, it was so covered in grease that even the text had turned red. This should be quite bright, it just looks dull, and that's after I've tried to clean it. It's quite incredible how broken it was. You can see someone's poor attempts at getting into it on the back. It's worse than my jobs on it. It still has an issue, which caused me issues when filming, in that the when it's set to automatic mode, so the aperture just closes down when you take the shot and opens back up again to make focusing easier. You can see that it gets stuck. Either I've reassembled it a little bit too tightly, or there's still something jamming up the aperture mechanism. So I shot the whole time on manual mode instead, where you can use your human strength in order to move it, and obviously it has no issues then. But it has other issues too. It's got something called Schneideritis, where it's got see if I can focus on this. It might not show up on this, I'll do a macro shot. There's these sorts of white dots around the inside of the front element. That's caused by flaking paint, the blacking paint around the outside of it. That's not great, but that doesn't affect the optics. The actual haze on this now is not too bad. It's quite mild after I sort of buffed it off as best I can. You can see it's got a slight sort of sheen to it inside, and it's not uniform across the internal element, but it does have an effect. And I think that effect is gorgeous, which might sound insane. Obviously this is a broken lens, but especially compared to other Mamiya lenses, the 82.8 I've got is one of the best lenses I own. It's optically beautiful, and this is clearly quite a lot worse, but what it is interesting, and a lot of people spend a lot of money trying to get this effect out of their modern glass, putting mist filters and things like that, diffusion filters on the fronts of their lenses, and it's not quite the same as having a worse piece of glass, and that's what this has inside it now. It reminds me of the look of my Rolleiflex T, and here's a few photos from it that sort of exhibit that glow. But that's really interesting. It's got a look, and it's a look that's very hard to emulate correctly. So this lens, because it was a bit of a bargain for me, and I don't massively use this focal length, I'll keep this lens and make good use of it, because I think it's got a really interesting look. It reminds me of old cinema, things like that. Those sort of Olivier de Havilland movies where they smear Vaseline over the lenses, all that sort of stuff. It's got that sort of soft glow that I think is very appealing, particularly for black and white photography. I think some of the black and white shots from this video were some of my favorites I've taken recently, even though they're not a very interesting subject matter. The look is really interesting, and I'll make use of this lens for that in the future. But let me know what you think down below. Have you tried any lenses like this? Have you tried emulating this sort of effect? Would you use something like this? I'd be really curious to know your thoughts. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Maybe with a less broken lens next time. Or maybe an even more broken one, because I do have a pile of them to fix.